Good evening. Welcome to this talk sponsored by the Amherst League of Women Voters and the Energy Subcommittee thereof. I am Richard Kuffler, Chair of the Energy Committee, and I'm fortunate to have a committee composed of members, all of whom participate and contribute much. So I'd like to take a brief moment to introduce them. Suzanne Patnode. You want to raise your hand or stay? Joyce Hatch, Martha Hanner, Peter Lilia, and Kay Fight over here. I'd like to mention a few ground rules for tonight's presentation. If you have a question during the presentation, we ask you to write it on the 3x5 card you've been given. And if you'd like, you can raise your hand and someone from the committee will come and pick it up. At the end of the presentation, there will be a question and answer period, during which time the committee will pick the appropriate ones from the audience questions. Appropriate being, if we judge that the question has already been answered, we won't bother to ask that question again. There'll be roughly 20 minutes. We have to be out of the library by 9 o'clock, so we need to quit promptly at 8:30 so we can put away all these chairs. Okay, and now without further ado, let me introduce Susan Patnode, who will introduce our speaker.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Patnode, and I am pleased to introduce Ann C. George, who is Vice President of External Affairs and Corporate Communications at ISO New England. In that role, Ms. George directs ISO New England's outreach to and communications with public officials, stakeholders, and the media. Before joining ISO in 2008, she served for 5 years as a commissioner of the Connecticut Public Utility Control. During this time, Ms. George was active in national and regional bodies, serving as chair of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners and as president of the New England Conference of Public Utility Commissioners. Prior to her role at the Connecticut PUC, Ms. George served as Governor's Special Counsel on Energy and Chief Legal Counsel. And I would also like to remind everybody to please silence your cell phones. And with that, I give you Ms. George.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you to the committee for inviting us to speak tonight. I'm here with one of my colleagues, Michael Jaimo, and so as we go through the presentation at the end of the night, I think we have copies of the presentation, so if anybody would like to take that, that's fine, or if you have any follow-up questions, you can grab either one of us. Am I coming through loud and clear? All right. So thank you for coming out. It's an awful kind of dreary night. We haven't had one of these rainy days in New England for a while. So it's nice to see, but it is not the greatest night to come out. So thank you for coming out. And I want to talk a little bit about ISO New England and our role and what we do, and then what we're seeing happen in the energy industry in New England. So we'll go through some slides, and then as the committee indicated, we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. So again, I wanted to talk about a little bit about ISO New England, what our major responsibilities are, what are the challenges we see facing the region, the impact of the state's public policies. The New England states are very active in the energy and environmental space, and so that's having an impact on not only what we see producing our energy and electricity, but also what we see happening in our wholesale electricity market. So we'll talk a little bit about that, what we see with resources being developed in the region, and then finally we'll touch a little bit on the transmission that's being built and what is potentially going to be needed if we transition to having more renewable energy in the region. So we like to start here because I think there's a lot of confusion about what ISO New England does. And this picture really tells a good story about the dividing line between our jurisdiction and the jurisdiction of the utilities that you generally deal with. So we handle the left side of the screen, the bulk power system, the high voltage transmission facilities. We operate those. We do not own them, but we operate them, we manage them to ensure that there is reliability in the region. And so while we don't own any of that, that's part of our charge. We are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. On the right side of the screen that you're looking at is the traditional distributed utility. They are regulated by the State Public Utility Commission, and they handle the distribution of the electricity from the high voltage system down to the distribution system to bring it to homes and businesses. So the New England system, it's fairly large, but it's actually one of the smaller regional systems in the country. We have 8,600 miles of high voltage transmission in the region. We have 13 ties to our neighbors, New York, Quebec, New Brunswick. We work closely with those neighbors, and they send in a decent amount of energy to serve the needs of New England. 16% of our needs in 2015 were served by those neighboring systems. We have spent some money in the region to invest in the transmission system. As you can see, it's a sizable amount, close to $8 billion since 2002, and we have another $4 billion planned that will be coming on through the system in the near future. We have more transmission that is proposed by private developers to bring renewable energy into the region, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. So, we've been around for about 20 years. We were created in 1997, and we were created to be an independent organization to manage the electricity system in the region. Prior to the creation of ISO New England and other similar organizations in the country, a lot of this was handled by utilities that owned not only the transmission, the distribution systems, and the generation. That was unbundled at the state level in terms of selling off generation, but and at the federal level, they created these organizations. We're not a federal agency. We are a private, not-for-profit agency, but we were kicked off by federal action at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Oh, actually, I want to point out, again, we are independent of all of the companies that participate in the wholesale electricity markets that own the generation, the transmission that we operate in the system. We're independent. Everybody that works at ISO New England can have no financial interest in any of the market participants in the electricity markets. We are also resource neutral. Our desire is to have reliable electricity. What produces that reliable electricity is not necessarily what we're going to focus on. What we're going to focus on is to make sure that whatever comes into our system can produce electricity in a reliable manner. So reliability is at the core of what we do. Everything we do kind of feeds that core mission. We are responsible for the day-to-day operations of the system, and we are responsible for planning for future needs. When we see potential reliability concerns coming, we are responsible for taking steps to ensure that the region has a plan to meet those needs. And we are responsible for developing and overseeing the wholesale electricity markets. So the first one, operations. That's a pretty clear link to reliability. We man our operations center in Holyoke 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we are charged with maintaining that minute-to-minute reliability of the system as electricity is generated and goes onto the wires, and it gets used by the whoever wants to consume that electricity. And so there's this constant balancing that needs to take place, and the men and women in our operations room are charged with maintaining that minute-to-minute reliability. We also, one of the primary functions that these folks work on is determining when there will be maintenance and outages. And so we plan for that, we know what's happening, and we manage the system around those outages. The wholesale electricity markets. There are multiple markets, and we could spend a lot of time talking about our marketplace, but I'll just kind of at a high level touch on the primary markets that we operate. There's an energy market, and that's where the daily market where you're buying and selling electricity based on what's needed for that day, that operating day. The forward capacity market is actually purchasing resources 3 years in the future to ensure that we have resources that will be able to produce electricity when we get into the operating day. So it's really future reliability. And then ancillary markets, which purchases the services that might be needed to manage frequency on the power system, voltage control on the power system. Reserves, we always carry reserves in case there's a particular plant that trips offline or a transmission line that goes down. And so these markets work together to ensure that we have the resources necessary to produce electricity to serve the needs and demands of the system. The market value of the market fluctuates year to year. And as you can see from this graph, it has fluctuated from highs in 2008 when we saw the price of oil and natural gas really rise to high levels in 2008. The blue bar is the energy market. That's the bulk of the dollars that flow through the wholesale electricity markets. $12 billion in 2008. And then you look at 2012, that was a fairly low year. That's when a lot of the lower priced natural gas started coming into the system, and we saw the market dip because of that lower priced natural gas. 2015 was a similarly priced year, and actually going into looking at 2016, the preliminary numbers suggest that it's even lower than that 2012 number. So we're seeing the low cost of natural gas really drive down the energy market. We're also seeing some of those investments that I talked about in the transmission system, being able to move low-priced energy around the system. Planning, that was the other major responsibility that I mentioned. Planning for reliability needs. We assess this system. We test it under various scenarios, and we look at potential overloads on the transmission system, other potential reliability concerns, and we work with the utilities to determine the need, but then also determine a potential solution to that need. We are required by mandatory reliability standards to conduct this process and to look at maintaining a system that meets certain required reliability standards. We also, through this process, look at resources that are coming into the system, and we ensure that how they're going to interconnect into the system doesn't damage the reliability of the system. So any power plant, wind farm, large solar array, if they are looking to interconnect into the bulk power system, then they have to go through a process where we study where they're interconnecting, what they're interconnecting, and ensure that they do it in a reliable manner. And we look out over a 10-year horizon so that we can make sure that we are planning with enough time to meet the needs, given how the process for building, siting, energy infrastructure can take some time. So we have those three major responsibilities, and every year we go through and we look at what are kind of the biggest challenges that we're seeing to the energy system in the region and to our ability to carry out those three responsibilities. And so these are kind of what we've laid out as the three top reliability risks that we see in the region. And they haven't changed very much over the past several years. We've highlighted these and we've talked a lot about them, and we haven't seen them necessarily get mitigated, go away. So they continue to be some challenges. And when we say reliability risk, it doesn't necessarily mean that we will definitely have reliability problems, but we see these as triggers that we need to be mindful of and plan for. So the first one touches on the forward capacity market that I talked about. And this is really looking at, do we have sufficient power plants, electric generating resources in the region to provide us with energy when we need it, and under a range of circumstances. And that's what the forward capacity market is intended to do. It is supposed to send the right price signals so that investors, developers, see that and want to invest in New England. It's a sort of critical market to send those investment signals out there to private investors. The challenge that we're seeing is we're seeing older resources retire. We're seeing resources that aren't making money in the markets look to leave. Primarily the older oil and coal fleet, but we've seen nuclear shut down. And so we need a mechanism like a capacity market to bring forward what's going to replace those resources that are leaving. So that's something that we've been working on and thinking about and trying to figure out, do we have the right market design to ensure that we have those replacement resources coming in when we see the older resources starting to retire. Resolving fuel adequacy constraints. I know that this has had a lot of discussion, in particular in this part of the state. It is something that, as we've seen, and I'll show some graphs on this, as we've seen more and more natural gas generation get built in the region, and at the same time we haven't seen the investment in pipeline infrastructure, we are starting to see the challenges of the generation units accessing natural gas. So that's something we'll talk about. And then the third one, integrating renewables. It's not that renewables cause reliability problems. It's that we want to make sure that we have sufficient tools and plans in place to manage a system with more and more renewables. So that's why that one is on the list. So what we've seen over the last 15 years or so, the region has really gone from a system that had a decent amount of nuclear facility, a decent amount of oil and coal, a little bit of natural gas, and then a little bit of other stuff. And we've seen this transition to, as you can see, in 2015, most of our electric energy, or close to half of the electric energy in the region, came from natural gas-fired generation resources. Nuclear has stayed about the same in terms of the percentage of electric production that they provide to the region. Oil and coal have been very challenged in this new world between environmental standards, but also the low price of natural gas has really pushed oil and coal kind of out of the market. They're not called on very often, but they still are necessary during certain very cold times of the year. And this graph really does, I think, a good job to show what we've seen come through the markets in New England to be built has by far been dominated by natural gas fired generation. It started in the late 1990s during the restructuring of the electric industry, but it has continued. And you know, we think it's, you know, for multiple reasons. It's fairly low priced. It has been easier to site generally than some of the other types of facilities, especially, you know, oil and coal have not been favored resources in New England for a long time. So there was this push to build a decent amount of natural gas fired generation, and you can really see that that's what has come through the market. And because we have so much natural gas fired generation, our price of electricity is very closely tied to the price of natural gas. You can see from this slide, going back to 2003, the prices have generally tracked each other. The spikes that we had in the winters of 2012 to 13, 13 to 14, and 14 to 15 were because the natural gas pipeline system was very constrained and the price of natural gas jumped, and therefore the price of electricity jumped. You see after the winter months it came right back down. Last year we had a fairly mild winter. We didn't see as many constraints, and we did not see the incredible price spikes in the region that we had seen in the previous winters. We've had some of the unfortunate high prices that have been tied to natural gas, but when the region can access low price natural gas, we see very low prices in the electricity industry. No, I'm good. Thank you. Another benefit to this transition that we've seen moving away from coal and oil to natural gas fired generation has been a reduction in power plant emissions in the region. We've seen reductions in NOx, SOx, carbon dioxide at fairly significant rates. That's been a great advantage for this region. We have seen in those winter spikes, so going back to those winter spikes, when we can't get natural gas to electric generators in the region, the ISO, in order to maintain reliability, has to turn to oil and coal during those cold periods. And so we have seen, while we've seen the overall reduction during those time periods, we've started to see a little bit of a blip tick back up, and we see the emissions profile change a little bit. So it's something we're watching, but you can pretty much tie it to when we have to rely on coal and oil, we see those emission rates tick back up. So I mentioned that we are concerned about resources leaving and retiring. I mean, some of these we're happy to see go because they haven't been very good performers. And that's what it comes down to. ISO New England, when we dispatch and call on a resource to produce electricity, we want to make sure that they can actually produce electricity. Some of the older units are old and they break easily. And so some of these that are leaving were those. So it's time for them to go. Others that are leaving and they're taking away some important fuel diversity that our operators would like to have on the system. I'll give an example, Brayton Point Station. It hasn't retired yet, but it's going to be leaving before next June. They signaled to us at approximately 3 years ago. that they were going to be retiring. When they leave, that's a fairly big station, 1,500 megawatts of coal and oil. When they leave, what's likely coming and what has come through the market in response to them leaving is more natural gas-fired generation. So we're losing oil and coal, which overall may be a good thing in terms of emissions, but we're replacing it with more natural gas-fired generation because that's what our market is bringing forward. And so it's a challenge to figure out, okay, these resources are leaving, the market is signaling and bringing forward natural gas-fired generation. What does that mean for operating a system that's that dependent on natural gas? Also on this list, we have 2 nuclear units, and Vermont Yankee has already shut down, and Pilgrim has signaled its intent to retire 2018. So they will be shutting down. That leaves the region with 2 operating nuclear facilities, Seabrook in New Hampshire and Millstone in Connecticut. And that is a dramatic change from the 70s, 80s, when there was substantial amounts of nuclear facilities in New England.
19.
Pilgrim, June of 2019. Thank you. So the capacity market is our tool to make sure that we are attracting new resources into the region to get built. These are private developers putting private capital into building new resources. It has predominantly been natural gas, as we've talked about, and we see where we needed those resources to come in, the market has responded. It's predominantly southeast Massachusetts, the Boston area, and Rhode Island, Connecticut. Those areas we've seen resources retire, and we've seen the need to have market signals bring those resources into that area. We've also seen renewable resources coming into through the capacity market. Demand resources are an important type of resource to have. Our operators can call on them. They reduce their demand and for demand response and for energy efficiency. That's considered a demand resource. So those are very important for the operators. Energy efficiency just takes away the demand and reduces the demand. And then imports, as I mentioned earlier. Imports, we rely to a decent amount on imports from our neighbors, and they can come through the capacity market as well. So I mentioned the state public policy, and that is driving a lot of what's happening in the region. Each state in New England has a renewable portfolio standard, and they also have added, certain states have done requirements to meet global warming, climate change goals and standards. Massachusetts is one that has clearly stated that they have requirements that they need to meet with emissions reductions. Other states, like for example New Hampshire, have goals that they have put out, but they aren't necessarily codified in state law. But each state has put out their either requirements or desired reductions in emissions. These public policies are providing a push to certain types of resources that we see coming through the market. And we have here what types of resources generally are being pushed by the states. Wind, solar, energy efficiency. We could also put hydro on as well, but in terms of the recent Massachusetts legislation looking at potentially Canadian hydro to bring down from Quebec. But as you can see, while these are pushing in developing these types of resources, they're still relatively small. And I don't think I mentioned, we have about, let's say, a 30,000 megawatt system. So 30,000 megawatts is what our system, and we're rounding the numbers, would need. And if you look at how much wind we have on the system, 800 megawatts. If we look at solar, through 2015, so these numbers have changed, and we update it every year, so we'll be updating it with the 2016 numbers. But the 2015 numbers of 1,300 megawatts, that's an incredible growth in solar, but it's still only a small portion of that 30,000 megawatts that would be needed for the system. Energy efficiency is also an area where we see the states investing a lot of ratepayer dollars, a lot of effort into energy efficiency programs. One thing on the wind that I should note is this 4,800 megawatts, this large bar that's proposed. Most of that is in Maine, and it is likely to be difficult to site it, and because it involves a lot of transmission. The resources in Maine, the transmission system in Maine is fairly weak given the population in some of these areas where you would build wind resources. And so there's a lot of wind proposed up there, but it isn't likely to get built until we figure out how to get it down to the load centers of southern New England. So I mentioned energy efficiency. The states in New England are spending approximately, they've spent $3 billion from 2009 to 2013, and I think it's approximately $1 billion a year that the states collectively are investing in energy efficiency. So that's an important piece, because we often hear, well, why does the market need to signal the need to build a new resource? Can't you just do more energy efficiency? You could always do more energy efficiency. The states have really focused on this and have been focusing on this for a long time. So a lot of the easy stuff has been done. And now it would just be, okay, what's left to do on energy efficiency? We recently, working with the states, started projecting out what's happening with solar. And we started doing this because up until recently, there really wasn't a lot of solar in the region. The states started promoting solar through different incentive programs, and we started seeing solar take off. Now, most of this, vast majority, is behind the meter. That means it's not interconnected to the systems that we operate. It's interconnected on the distribution system. It's mainly the rooftop solar. You see some community solar out there. But we don't control it, we don't see it. What we see is a reduction in demand on the system. And so I can show you this is what we're this is a typical sunny spring day where we're trying to figure out what would the load shape look like if we didn't have the solar. And so the solid line is what the actual load was. The dotted line is what we're estimating would have been the demand if we didn't have solar power on the system. So we see it as a reduction. And it's interesting, our operators and our system planners have been looking at this and looking at the growth of solar. And they're starting to see some interesting potential trends in the future as we get higher and higher amounts of solar. And we're seeing what we would say would be the peak demand during the day. We're seeing that shift out to later in the day. We're seeing potentially some real low dips in the middle of the day from, if it's a hot, sunny day from all that solar. They're already experiencing this in California. they've called it the duck curve because it kind of looks like a duck. Ours doesn't quite look like a duck yet. I don't know what it looks like, a salamander or something. But it's something that our operators are starting to really look at to say, okay, this is really changing what historically we've seen on the system. Because our system operators, you start to see a pattern of usage. And day after day, seasonally, they're very good at forecasting what the needs on the system are. But as solar starts to change when the peaks are, change what happens, if you have solar and then all of a sudden you have cloud cover come in, what that does for the system, do we have the right resources? Has had an impact on our forecast for demand growth. We have seen the peak demand, which the peak demand will drive kind of what we need to make sure we have on the system, because we have to plan for the peak. We can't say, well, on average, we only need 20,000 megawatts. We have to plan for that peak cold day, the peak hot day. And so looking at the peak is what we think about. And we're starting to see that energy efficiency and solar really flatten that projection. On the average, the annual energy use, we are actually seeing energy efficiency and solar start to move the line down. So it's having that impact on the average use. But if you look at the peak, it's still slightly growing, but it's getting flatter. And I touched a little bit on this earlier. The wind proposals in Maine, you see it's almost all in Maine. We now have some offshore wind being proposed. And we see these proposals come through what we call our interconnection queue. That's where developers come in and say, I've got a project, I'm interested in pursuing this project. What will it take for me to interconnect to the high voltage system? So we see kind of a sense of what the developers are thinking. That doesn't mean that everything's going to get built that comes into the interconnection queue, because some resources it may just be too costly for them to interconnect. It may be that they run into siting issues and have problems and difficulties with the location that they've chosen. So it's not that everything will, you see on the proposed generation, you see a lot of natural gas and wind, and the wind is in Maine, and that's challenged by transmission and the lack of transmission up in Maine. We do have significant wind potential, and this slide does a good job of showing you where that is located and where the red demand centers are in the region. Demand is pretty much focused on the southern New England states and the southern part of New Hampshire. If you look at where the wind potential is, it is generally far away from those red areas. Offshore wind potential is there on the coast of Massachusetts. Maine actually has potential there, but if you look at Massachusetts and Rhode Island, significant potential there. That's closer to the load center, but it's offshore wind, which makes it somewhat more challenging than onshore wind to bring in, but it is closer. So that is something, the Massachusetts is looking at offshore wind. We've seen Rhode Island, Black Island Wind just became operational. And so we expect to see more offshore wind looking to be developed in the region. And we are seeing transmission proposals. So when I talked about system planning and that being one of our major responsibilities, it is really to look at the transmission system and the reliability needs of the system. We also look to private developers that are thinking about transmission, not necessarily to meet reliability needs, but to bring renewable energy into the market, or potentially something else into the market that doesn't necessarily mean it's a reliability project. So it's not something that through our mandatory reliability standards we've identified. These are private developers saying, you know what, I've got another project that I might be interested in building. Predominantly, this is wind and hydropower from Canada. We've got several proposals coming. The most talked about proposal is Northern Pass in New Hampshire, bringing hydropower down from Quebec. But there's also proposals coming through Vermont, and then proposals coming through Maine down to the load centers in southern New England. So that is something that we're continuing to watch. We don't really have a role in this other than to study it to determine that it can interconnect reliably into the system. So I'll stop there. I've touched on the major concerns we see and what we're watching, the retirement of the older oil and coal fleet, nuclear plants retiring, natural gas resources coming in to replace that, the need for fuel infrastructure, the potential for wind, but there's some challenges with getting the wind to the load centers, and then state public policy is really pushing a large amount of resources through energy efficiency, solar, and the impacts that will have on operating a system. So with that.
So could you please pass your written questions in this direction, and I've got a few to kick it off.
Okay.
Who owns the grid?
So who owns the grid? So the utilities, the traditional utilities, Eversource,
Down. Thanks.
National Grid, Central Maine Power, Emera Power, Avant Grid in Connecticut. The traditional utilities, they still own the grid. We operate the system to ensure that we manage the flows over the grid.
Okay, what changes in the grid are required in order to handle intermittent sources such as wind and solar?
So, it's not necessarily, well, let's start where it changes in the grid. You, to handle additional renewable resources, you're going to have to build out the system to get to those resources if they're in remote locations. So if you look at wind, as I mentioned, in locations like Maine, there's going to need additional transmission investment to bring that down. But other than that, the tools that will be necessary are improved forecasting. The forecasting that will be necessary, and we're working on this, to understand more kind of micro forecasts as we see more solar and wind. Understand if parts of the region will have wind for a period of time that will disappear like that. What does that mean for the system? Are you going to have the flexible, fast-starting resources able to turn on quickly to replace if the wind goes away quickly? Same with solar. If the solar goes away quickly, do you have what you need to turn on quickly to cover for that when it goes away? Those resources, they're wonderful additions, but they're not the on-call resources. We can't call up and say, turn on the wind farm. It's just, if the wind's not blowing, it's not blowing. So that becomes more of a challenge. So it becomes, what tools do we have, and do we have the resources necessary to cover for it?
I had a question right in my head, but it was interrupted by one about power surges from the. Yeah, I'm sorry. I was also thinking that in addition to the sun going down, what happens when there's a big power surge that's loading into the current system, like the sun is just shining or we have a big blast of wind, and how does the system handle that?
So I'm not an engineer, I'm an attorney. In terms of the technical aspects. I won't go into those. But in terms of how we run the system, we have seen situations where there is more wind and more, let's say, hydro coming onto the system at the same time, and the transmission system can't handle that in the location, and you have to back down one of them. So that's either, potentially spilling hydro or turning off a wind generator, and that's done through our operators saying, calling them and saying, this is it. We've changed our market rules to allow for those resources now to bid in at negative prices, which allows us to back down other resources that are higher priced, and they would keep running at a very low price. They can tend to run at negative prices when they have to, because they have federal production tax credits, investment tax credits, renewable energy credits, and so it allows them to continue operating at negative prices for a period of time. So we also, if we have too much power coming into the system and the demand isn't there, this happens sometimes in the spring, it seems like Sunday mornings in the spring, we see this a lot. We'll have a minimum generation warning, and it's a signal that goes out basically telling resources stop producing so much, and they have to back down. It becomes a reliability concern.
And that leads to 4 questions we have about storage.
Oh, I didn't even mention storage.
And how it's being incentivized, and what the future of storage looks like.
Yep. So in New England, we actually have a wonderful storage facility. We think it's wonderful because it provides a lot of operational flexibility on the system, and that's Northfield Mountain. And that is a traditional storage facility. It is a pretty sizable amount of pumped hydro that can come into the system and produce electricity very quickly. So if we see an issue on the system, we can call on them and they'll be there. The new incentives are really targeting battery storage and new technologies. The need for those will be growing as we get more variable intermittent resources on the system. Storage will partner up nicely with some of those types of resources. We haven't seen a lot come into show an interest in our marketplace yet, but we're starting to see some interest from developers coming into the interconnection queue, and we expect to see more and more of that. How that fits into our system, since we do have this pumped hydro facility that really does provide a lot of that flexibility that storage new storage would give us. We're not sure exactly how much storage will be needed in the region, but I think as the system starts to progress to more and more renewable intermittent resources, we're going to see that need grow. We do see that happening in other regions of the country.
Can you tell everyone here what demand response is and how it participates in the market?
Sure. So demand response, let's take a Walmart, for example. May sign their stores up in a demand response program run by a market participant. The market participant would, let's say, Walmart says we'll shut down under certain circumstances, a certain, every other aisle, certain amount of lighting, and we can, save this amount. So they'll enter that into the market. Right now, it's a capacity market that they would come into, and we can kind of call on them and count on them for certain periods. In the future, near future, we're developing a marketplace where they can come into the day-to-day energy market and participate as any other generating plant. But they would be called on during, in that world, based on price. So they would price how much, if the energy price was X, then you could call on them and they've made that decision that they're willing to reduce their demand because the price got to whatever that amount is. So it's a tool that the operators can use, and this region was actually one of the first regions to really push for having demand response be treated similarly as a generating resource.
Okay, is new transmission technology needed in order to carry power greater distances more efficiently? And is it being looked into and developed?
So, I think that the technologies that are out there for transmission right now for New England seem to be fairly efficient in terms of moving power from certain distances around. You do see in other parts of the region or country and in other countries that where you need to send power over very long distances, that certain technologies are used. Here in New England, we're a fairly small region, so I think the losses from our system are very small, and so the types of transmission technology that's available for the region right now, I think, is sufficient for New England. You do see some other areas look to do more of the HVDC type of transmission. That's the direct current transmission, and that you'll see that more. Actually, we'll start to see a lot of that if we start to see the offshore wind move forward.
All right, we're combining a couple of questions here, so I'm going to ask you a different one first. Why wasn't there a big drop from 2000 to 2015 in nuclear energy due to the anticipated closing of Vermont Yankee? It only dropped from 31 to 30%.
So I'm trying to recall, when did Vermont Yankee actually close? 14.
End of 14.
So remember when I showed those were percentages, and those were percentages of electricity production. So if you look at, even with Vermont Yankee off the system, the nuclear fleet is a pretty reliable, stable fleet, and was producing similar amounts of electricity onto the system. The nuclear fleet is traditional base load power. They're operating all the time unless they're down for refueling or something else happens. But they're pretty reliable, pretty stable, so you don't see those percentages change very often, even with one resource leaving the system.
The next one, I'm combining two questions for a two-parter. From what parts of the country does our natural gas supply come from, and is there a need for more natural gas pipeline capacity in Massachusetts in order to keep electricity prices down?
Okay, good questions. Predominantly now, the natural gas is coming from the Marcellus Shale, which is in Pennsylvania. It comes up through pipelines through New York and into New England. We have 5 pipelines coming into the region, and 3 of those are coming up from that area of Pennsylvania. Before the Marcellus Shale and the development of those gas resources happened, our gas was coming predominantly from the Gulf Coast. So it was coming up from that area, and we used to talk about New England as being at the end of the pipeline. We're still technically at the end of the pipeline, but the source of natural gas has gotten much closer to the region. We are seeing a lot of development in other parts, but the Marcellus Shale seems to be the area that would be sending predominantly most gas to this region. In terms of price, so what we have said, and when we show what the wholesale markets are revealing in terms of price, we have said that if there was additional pipeline infrastructure, you wouldn't have those constraints, you wouldn't have those needle spikes that I showed on the price graph. And that would, probably reduce prices for those parts of the year. When we don't have a constrained natural gas system, we are seeing the ability to access lower priced natural gas throughout the months. So even if we do have a constrained period, if you look at the whole year, we're seeing lower prices. And so that's generally driven by that low price from Marcellus Shale. I think some of the prices that they're seeing actually at the source are, pennies almost. And so you add the cost to transport it up to New England, and in sometimes of the year it's $2-3 for natural gas up into New England. During the winter months, that can spike to $25-30. So you do see this kind of tenfold increase during certain months of the year when you have a constrained pipeline. And it really, the pipeline system was built out to serve home heating needs generally, not to serve these electric generators. And now we have a lot of electric generation based on natural gas, but we still have that need for customers to have home heating through natural gas. And we haven't seen, there's this mismatch on the two industries in terms of how infrastructure gets built. ISO New England doesn't have a role in saying natural gas pipelines should get built. What our role is saying, here's an electricity need. We don't see how they're going to get their fuel unless more pipeline infrastructure or potentially LNG comes into the system. So that is something that could potentially lower prices, and we've tried to kind of highlight the need, but there's not much that we can do. One thing we can do, and this isn't the most efficient way to operate the system and to run our markets, but if a non-gas resource like an older oil coal unit seeks to retire, we might say it's hard to let you retire because we don't know if we're going to have enough natural gas, enough fuel in the system to run our natural gas fleet. That's not a good answer for anybody. And so that is something that we see as a potential problem facing the region as we go forward.
The next question is about smart grid, and so I thought I'd throw microgrids in there too, and see if you could explain what smart grid and microgrids are, and how they could contribute to the reliability of the system when variable sources play a larger role in supply.
Yep. So the smart grid can mean all sorts of different things to all sorts of different people. I think it basically, the smart grid means that you'll have intelligent technology that will respond to the demands, the fluctuating demands on the system. And we see this through smart meters. We see this through different technologies that can adjust demand on its own without consumers being involved at all. And so the smart grid kind of takes, in a lot of ways, takes the consumer out of it, and sends the right signals to manage the fluctuating nature of the electricity system. A smart grid and a microgrid is a way for, whether it's a building, whether it's a set of buildings, to connect with each other, and they can have the variable resources, but they have these are great applications for batteries potentially. So you have the solar panels on the building, but you also have storage, a battery. You might have a combined heat and power system, and you can use all of that to manage the changing needs within a group of buildings, or a small city, small town. We actually saw after Hurricane Sandy, it was Irene, and then we had the crazy snowstorm, and then Hurricane Sandy hit, boom, boom, boom. And we saw a lot of states kind of create policies to incentivize microgrids and have this ability to kind of have a more resilient system. Now the issue is that even if you have a microgrid or a system, for the most part you're still pulling off of the larger grid and you're not completely disconnected. And that is one thing that I think as we see more and more of this take place, we're going to kind of try to understand when it's going to be hard to understand when they're going to need the grid, the larger grid, when they're going to be off the grid, when they're sending power back to the grid, and that becomes much more challenging for operators to handle. I mean, we've moved from a system where operators knew that they had large plants with either a coal pile next to it or an oil tank next to it, nuclear facilities. They knew what they were dealing with, and I think the smart grid, microgrids kind of show how that world was, as difficult and maybe challenging as that world was, that was very easy as you move into a system where you've got power coming onto the grid, power going off the grid, and operators can't necessarily see what's producing at what time.
Okay, I'm combining two questions again. Why is Maine wind considered to be too far, but Canadian hydro is not too far away? And in planning for the future, how does ISO take into consideration potential opposition to new transition systems? And they have, for example, Northern Pass.
All right, so the first one was, why is Maine wind considered far and Canadian hydro is not? That's a good question. They're both far. I don't necessarily think that Canadian hydro is not far. It is something that people have looked to build additional lines to access Canadian hydro. I actually had the opportunity to go visit their large dam way up north in Canada. It's just unbelievably how far north it is. And the power lines that they have coming down from that area are huge, long power lines. That's only to get it to Montreal and that area, and then you still would have to get it into New England. We already have a couple of interconnections that connect to Canadian hydro, and so I think that people are looking to say, you know what, that's a great resource. They have potentially excess hydro that they're looking to sell to our region. It might be something to access. It's not an easy sell. It's expensive. You'd still need long transmission lines to get it down. With the wind in Maine, it's amazing how big the state of Maine is. I think everybody forgets that how big the state of Maine is. And the system up there was built to handle very small amounts of people. One of the legislators up there always has said to us, he has more moose in his district than people. The system was not built to serve and bring down a lot of wind energy. So while it might be closer than Canadian hydro, it's still far away from the load centers, and so both would require substantial transmission. What was the other question? Northern Pass.
Yeah.
So
Opposition.
So we are required to study the needs for transmission to meet reliability needs. Northern Pass is not one of those projects that's needed to meet reliability needs. It is a project that private developers, Eversource and Hydro-Quebec, have put forward as a potential project to bring forward additional hydro. It's something that we study to make sure that if it does get built, it can interconnect into the system in a reliable manner, but it's nothing that we are out there saying needs to get built. We're watching it because it will impact our system, and it will have an impact on what resources we have available to us, but it's not anything that we are out there advocating for. We do know, and we watch the discussions in New Hampshire in particular, so we do know that there's a lot of discussion up there as they figure out the potential siting for that project.
We just got kind of a related question. I've been trying to take them in order, but can you comment on the feasibility of underground transmission lines versus the tall transmission towers?
So the feasibility, I think it depends on where you are. I know that that's been one of the issues being discussed in New Hampshire in terms of undergrounding, more of that. Undergrounding is going to be more expensive. And in New Hampshire, Mike actually he's lived and breathed more of this in New Hampshire. It's the granite state, so it becomes very difficult to underground a lot of it. I know that most people would rather not see the transmission lines, and so undergrounding is something that a lot of people turn to, but it can be challenging in certain areas. I live in the state of Connecticut, and when we had some large transmission projects proposed for Southwest Connecticut, some of the towns down there said they were adamant. They did not want to see the transmission lines. ISO New England said, well, there's a reliability need. We need the project to solve the reliability concerns. But undergrounding wasn't part of what ISO New England was suggesting. It was what the towns were suggesting. So when it came time to figure out how to pay for the line and how to allocate costs across the region, because if it's a reliability project, everybody in the region shares in paying the cost, because we're such a tightly knit small region. Reliability projects in one part can help in another part. So if undergrounding was desired by a local community, they would pay the extra costs for undergrounding. So in Connecticut, they paid extra for just that portion, and the rest was shared regionally.
Okay, Massachusetts promotes solar. Is this good or bad for the energy market? And are the new solar SRECs sufficient to continue to incentivize solar growth?
Okay, I'm going to pass on that second part because I am not qualified to answer on the right level of SRECs to promote solar. So I know that there's a big discussion, and not only in Massachusetts, but in many states, looking at what's the right incentive level to have to promote solar. In terms of solar coming into our markets, solar is a great resource to come into the market. As I mentioned, most of it doesn't come into our market, though. We don't see a lot of it. It is rooftop solar, smaller solar installations that don't interconnect to the system. They don't participate in our daily energy markets. They don't come into our capacity market for the most part because they don't necessarily, they're individual owners. They're not buyers and sellers of our electricity. They're not traders in the electricity market. So most of them don't come into the market. We do have one or two solar farms that are interconnected to the system. Mike, do you recall what town that is? It's off of the Mass Pike.
Broomfield?
No.
It's between exit 8 and exit 9.
Exit 8 and 9 off the Mass Pike.
Oh, God.
We've driven by it so many times. But it's a...
Northeast Utilities has that big one,
Yeah, so some of them look big. You look at a vast array of solar panels on the Mass Pike at some of the rest stops. They now have some arrays of solar panels, and you think, oh, that's a big one. That's got to be a lot, and it's still not a lot. The one that is actually interconnected to the system is maybe about 10 megawatts, maybe.
Yeah, it's about
Maybe,
10, 12.
and it takes up acres and acres of old golf course land. So it's funny. You start to see them popping up everywhere, and you think, well, these are really producing a lot of electricity. And they're helpful, but they're not producing a ton of electricity to take the place of Pilgrim shutting down, for example. So while they're helpful, and we'll probably start to see more community solar, large arrays coming into our markets, we just haven't seen a ton of it come into the market yet.
And to tag along to that, what is the maximum percentage of solar and wind that the system can absorb?
That's the million-dollar question. I have no idea. We've actually done wind studies in the past. It's been a while since we did our first wind study, and we said about 20%. The system could handle about 20% wind. That was just wind. We don't believe we've looked at how much solar we could handle with wind. We are currently in the process of doing what we call scenario analysis, and we look at different scenarios that, whether it's the New England states or market participants have given us different scenarios to kind of test the system. And we've looked at kind of the economics of if we had a system where all of the renewable portfolio standards were met, and so we saw a great amount of renewable energy in the region. What would that mean for the economics of the system? And then we're about to enter the phase of looking at what it might mean for the operations of the system. So we've been working on that kind of the second part of this year, and we'll continue into 2017 looking at that. But that's something that our system planning group does to say, okay, let's look at various scenarios and what that might mean for the system. So it's hard to say, what that exact penetration level where we say the system can't handle anymore. And I think it's constantly changing too. As we see, when we came up with that 20% figure, we had some of the large stations still around. As we see more of the large stations leave, that number is likely to change.
Okay, this is a tough one. Can you clarify ISO New England's role in soliciting bids for the energy auction? And can ISO New England encourage other players to participate in the market, or is ISO New England constrained in its role by FERC?
Okay, so we have approximately 500 market participants in the region. That number has grown dramatically since the early 2000s. So the market and the marketplace is driven by those decisions of the market participants to offer their production of their electricity into the energy market, for example. So the energy market, daily market, they decide that whoever owns power plant X or soon to be demand response that we'll be able to offer into the energy market, they can say, I can produce 10 megawatts at X amount of dollars, and our energy market will look at, well, what's my need for the day, and will determine where do I have to stop going up the bid stack. So looking at the price of what's been offered into the energy market going up, we'll look at up to the point where need is met, and then everything below that will participate in providing electricity into the market. So it's not that we're necessarily constrained in terms of how many market participants can participate. It's a pretty open, competitive, transparent marketplace. In the capacity market, we do see new market participants coming into the region. We run the capacity market is an annual market, so every year, getting ready for that auction to take place, the resources have to come in and say, this is what I want to offer in to the market and to the auction. We determine what they would be qualified, and we look at their capabilities. We look at whether they would actually get sited and built within 3 years, because it's a look for getting resources 3 years in the future. And so if we determine that they are qualified, then they can bid into the capacity market. And if the price, they drop out. If the price stays where they're willing to take that, then they stay in. If it goes too low, the price ticks down. If it goes too low, they drop out. They don't participate in our they don't get a winning bid in our auction. So that's, it's a pretty robust competitive marketplace. And actually, the low prices that we've seen in the energy market, they really do reveal how competitive it is, because the prices match the fuel. And if you look at that, that's what signifies that they're not adding anything else to their bid. It's almost all fuel costs. And so it's a pretty competitive marketplace that can come up with an efficient cost.
And as Ann mentioned, we're technology neutral, we're fuel neutral. The market is neutral to that. What resources come is what resources come. The ISO doesn't influence what resources come to market. It's the market that dictates.
That's right. That's right. And that we have, I've had people say, well, why can't ISO New England promote more renewable resources into the market? And we say that that's not part of our mission. And our mission is to come up with the most cost-effective set of resources to meet the reliability needs. And so it's based on price. We have had some discussions with the New England states and with other market participants recently about some of the state policies, and could you potentially bring a price of carbon into our market? That would be the most efficient way to kind of drive a market response to have a more clean energy resources coming through the marketplace. We don't have that clearly in our in our tariff, in our mission that is overseen by FERC. It's something that potentially could come our way if, I don't know about under the new administration, but it could potentially.
Well, that's the next question, so you can just jump right into
that.
What changes in federal energy policy will affect ISO New England?
So we've had a lot of conversations about this recently. This is clearly one of them. Under the Obama administration, they were very, very clear about their climate policy. We saw the Clean Power Plan pushing states to come up with how they were going to meet the requirements of the Clean Power Plan. And the New England states have their own individual state policies. And so one of the discussions was, okay, well, if our markets are designed to produce, or based on the price that's offered in, and to produce the most cost-effective set of resources, and let's say renewable resources are higher priced, and they'll never come through the market, how are you going to meet these policy goals? So that's what's prompted this discussion about, could you potentially come up with a price of carbon to kind of layer into the wholesale electricity markets. From the state perspective, they were looking to not do it necessarily with a carbon price, but to possibly do some other things to get their public policies into our wholesale marketplace. And from a federal level, we may have been able to do it under the Obama administration. I think it would be very challenging from everything that's been signaled. We have no idea, though, what the new administration is going to be doing. So we do know that we will have new federal energy regulators. Maybe not immediately, because FERC is fairly low down on the totem pole in terms of presidential appointments. But we expect that we have 2 vacancies now. We expect that those would be filled, and we're not sure about the existing 3 regulators that are sitting there. It's hard to say what new initiatives would be coming. I think infrastructure will be something that they focus on, but beyond that, it's not clear yet, but we'll be definitely watching. That said, I think the 6 New England states, I don't expect major changes in state policy going forward, even though we have 2 new governors, one in Vermont and one in New Hampshire, but I don't expect major changes in state policy.
I was saving this one for last, but I'm going to jump to it because you talked about infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
What's the age of the current transmission systems in New England, and who funds building new transmission lines?
So we went through a period of time in the region where we really didn't invest very much in the transmission system. And starting in 2002, 2003 timeframe, we started that kind of reinvestment because our system had aged and needed additional investments. We were starting to see new generating plants come into the system that can change the nature of what's needed in the transmission system. So we have done a pretty dramatic build out of the transmission system since 2002. So the average age is probably in that time span. The distribution systems are typically older systems. The distribution utilities are making investments in their systems, but the transmission system has done a tremendous amount of build out since 2002. The costs for that are spread around the region if they're reliability projects, which is what I'm referring to now. And it's done based, let's say, Massachusetts has 50% of the load in the region, so they would have 50% of the costs of transmission projects needed for reliability. So even if the project was completely in Vermont, Massachusetts ratepayers would cover 50% of the costs. But Vermont, which has approximately 4% of the load, would cover 4% of projects in Massachusetts.
And Massachusetts is about 46%.
46, so I said half.
It's not as bad.
46%. And then Connecticut is about 27%, 25%. Mike's going to keep me honest.
Maine is 9, New Hampshire's 9, Rhode Island's 7. Yeah,
so Massachusetts definitely is the biggest user of electricity. Obviously, it's the biggest, most populated state in the region.
And our last question, I'm combining a bunch of questions here, but they had to do with using LNG or ethanol to power existing plants which are being shut down. And part of the question had to do with the cost of alternative fuels, which I think you already answered as a policy, but wondering whether or not it's possible to power these plants up again and use either LNG or ethanol.
So I don't know. I do know that as plants are potentially shutting down, they are looking at whether they're looking at repowering them under a new framework, or if they sell the plant and somebody else wants to come in and possibly repower them. I don't know the technical feasibility of certain plants being converted to operate on a different alternative fuel. It's probably possible, but I don't know that if the cost is prohibitive or not. With LNG should be able to be burned in natural gas plants, no problem. And that is something, we do have substantial amounts of LNG usually coming into the system in the winter months. The question with LNG is it's a global market, and we're not always sure if New England prices will drive the shipments here for LNG to serve as that fuel source for the natural gas plants. Is that it? All right. Thank you all very much.
Very informative.
Okay, good.
So that was a very informative presentation. I'd like to congratulate the audience also on its perceptive questions. But it's time for us to close up. We have to be out of here by 9 o'clock and put the room back the way we found it. So I hope you all have a safe ride home, and thank you for coming.
Next week, please.
Oh yes, one last announcement. A week from tonight, on Tuesday, December 6th, there will be another talk on wind energy. The speaker will be Professor James Manuel from the University of Massachusetts, a longtime participant and researcher in wind energy. The only difference, it'll be from, like tonight, from 7 o'clock until 8:30. The difference is that it's in the Bangs Community Center on Boltwood Walk. I'm hoping you'll see some publicity about that as well. And I invite you all to that as well. Thank you and good night.
What's the game time again?